Today's lesson is on fallacies and argumentation. So today's goals are to learn to argue well, recognize fallacies, avoid inconsistencies, develop your own arguments, and analyze arguments that you read. The quote of the day is, "Don't raise your voice, improve your argument." And the topics we'll be going over are good arguments, informal fallacies, inconsistency, and then the week's homework. So, a good argument. A good argument, to be logically correct and fulfill the purposes for which we use arguments, should 1. Be deductively valid or inductively strong and have all premises true. Have its validity or inductive strength and truth of premises be as evident as practically possible to the parties involved. 3. Be clearly stated, using understandable language and making clear what the premises and conclusion are. 4. Avoid circularity, ambiguity, and emotional language. And 5. Be relevant to the issue at hand. If you fulfill these, then you're arguing well. First, a good argument should be deductively valid or inductively strong and have all premises true. We often criticize an argument by trying to show that the conclusion doesn't follow from or isn't supported by the premises, or that one or more of the premises are false. Second, a good argument should have its validity or inductive strength and truth of premises be as evident as practically possible to the parties involved. Arguments are less effective if they presume premises that others see as false or controversial. Ideally, we'd like to use only premises that everyone will accept as immediately obvious, but in practice, this is too high an ideal. We often appeal to premises that will only be accepted by those of similar political, religious, or philosophical views. And sometimes we appeal to hunches, like, "I can get to the gun before the thief does." While not ideal, this may be the best we can do at the given moment. Third, a good argument should be clearly stated. It should use understandable language and make clear what the premises and conclusion are. Obscure or overly complex language makes reasoning harder to grasp. When we develop an argument, a good strategy is to put it on paper in a preliminary way and then reread it several times, trying to make improvements. Try to express the ideas more simply and clearly, and think how others may object or misunderstand. Often, ideas first emerge in a confused form. Clarity comes later after much hard work. While mushy thinking is often unavoidable in the early development of an idea, it's not acceptable in the final product. People often argue without making clear what their premises and conclusions are. Sometimes we get stream of consciousness ramblings, sprinkled with an occasional therefore. While this is unacceptable, a good argument needn't spell everything out. It's fine to omit premises that are obvious to the parties involved. If I'm hiking on the Appalachian Trail, I might say to my hiking partner, "We can't still be on the right trail since we don't see white blazes on the trees." This is fine if my partner knows that we'd see white blazes if we were on the right trail. Then the full argument would be pedantic. We don't see white blazes on the trees. If we were still on the right trail, then we'd see white blazes on the trees. Therefore, we aren't still on the right trail. In philosophy, it's often wise to spell out all our premises, since unstated ideas are often crucial but unexamined. Suppose someone argues, "We can't be free, since all our actions are determined." This assumes the italicized premise. All human actions are determined. No determined action is free. Therefore, no human actions are free. We should be aware that we're assuming this controversial premise. So a good argument should be valid or inductively strong and have premises all true. This validity/strength and truth should be as evident as practically possible, and it should be clearly stated. Our final conditions say that the argument should 4. Avoid circularity, ambiguity, and emotional language, and 5. Be relevant to the issue at hand. 5 common fallacies tie into these final conditions. Our first fallacy is circularity. An argument is circular if it presumes the truth of what is to be proved. A series of arguments is circular if it uses a premise to prove a conclusion, and then uses that conclusion to prove the premise. The soul is immortal because it can't die is circular, since the premise just repeats the conclusion in different words. The argument takes for granted what it's supposed to prove. A circular series of arguments might say, A is true because B is true, and B is true because A is true. A circular argument is also said to be question-begging. This differs from the new and confusing usage in which begging a question means raising a question. Here's the second fallacy and a crude argument that exemplifies it. An argument is ambiguous if it changes the meaning of a term or phrase within the argument. So, for example, love is an emotion. God is love, therefore God is an emotion. Premise 1 requires that we take love to mean the feeling of love, which makes premise 2 false or doubtful. Premise 2 requires that we take love to mean a supremely loving person or the source of love, which makes premise 1 false or doubtful. We can have both premises clearly true only by shifting the meaning of love. Ambiguity is also called equivocation. Unclear sentence structures can also bring ambiguities. For example, pretty little girls camp can mean camp for little girls who are pretty, pretty camp for little girls, or pretty camp that is little and for girls. It's important to avoid emotionally slanted terms when we reason. To appeal to emotion is to stir up feelings instead of arguing in a logical manner. Students, when asked to argue against a theory, often just describe the theory in derogatory language. So a student might dismiss Descartes by calling his views superficial or overly dualistic. But such verbal abuse doesn't give any reason for thinking a view wrong. Often the best way to argue against a theory is to find some false implication and then reason as follows. If the theory is true, then this other thing also would be true. This other thing isn't true, therefore the theory isn't true. Recall that an argument consists of premises and a conclusion. Our last condition says that a good argument must be relevant to the issue at hand. A clearly stated argument might prove something and yet still be defective, since it may be beside the point in the current context. An argument is beside the point if it argues for a conclusion irrelevant to the issue at hand. Hitler, when facing a group opposed to the forceful imposition of dictatorships, shifted their attention by attacking pacifism. His arguments, even if sound, were beside the point. Such arguments are also called red herrings, after a practice used in training hunting dogs. A red herring fish would be dragged across the trail to distract the dog from tracking an animal. In arguing, we must keep the point at issue clearly in mind and not be misled by a smelly fish. Students sometimes use this beside the point label too broadly to apply to almost any fallacy. This fallacy isn't about the premises being irrelevant to the conclusion. Instead, it's about the conclusion, regardless of whether it's proved, being irrelevant to the issue at hand. Suppose a politician is asked, "Where do you stand about the proposed tax cuts?" but evades answering, instead shifting our attention to the need for a strong military. These statements are beside the point since they don't answer the question. One common form of this fallacy has its own name. A strawman argument misrepresents an opponent's views. This is common in politics. Candidate A for mayor suggests cutting a few seldom-used stations on the rapid transit system. Then candidate B's campaign ad expresses shock that A wants to dismantle the whole transit system, which so many citizens depend on. The ad attacks not what A actually holds, but only a straw man, a scarecrow of B's invention. Campaign ads and speeches that distort an opponent's view have recently got so bad that fact-checkers and truth squads have arisen to point out misleading language and downright falsehoods, regardless of which side engages in these. Again, a good argument is valid or inductively strong and has premises all true. Has this validity/strength and truth be as evident as practically possible, is clearly stated, avoids circularity, ambiguity, and emotional language, and is relevant to the issue. Good arguments normally convince others, but not always. Some people aren't open to rational argument on many issues. Some believe that the earth is flat, despite good arguments to the contrary. And bad arguments sometimes convince people. Hitler's beside the point fallacy and the candidate straw man fallacy can mislead and convince. Studying logic can help protect us from bad reasoning. The better we can distinguish good from bad reasoning, the less will politicians and others be able to manipulate people. Proof is roughly like good argument, but we can prove something even if our argument is unclear, contains emotional language, or is irrelevant to the issue at hand. And a proof must be very strong in its premises and in how it connects the premises to the conclusion. For the latter reason, it seems wrong to call inductive arguments proofs. So we can define a proof as a non-circular, non-ambiguous, deductively valid argument with clearly true premises. A refutation of a statement is a proof of the statement's denial. Proof can also have other meanings. For example, logic proofs, in the technical sense of formal proof, to cover logical derivations that follow specified rules. And one of the homework exercises explained that proof can have various meanings in the question, can we prove that there are external objects? The word proof has a cluster of related meanings. Prove and refute are often misused. These properly apply only to successful arguments. A proof shows that something is true, and a refutation shows that something is false. Avoid saying things like, Hume proved this, but Kant refuted him. This is self-contradictory, since it implies that Hume's claim is both true and false, and that Hume showed it was true and Kant showed it was false. It's better to say, Hume argued for this, but Kant criticized his reasoning. Informal fallacies. A fallacy is a deceptive error of thinking. An informal fallacy is a fallacy not covered by some system of deductive or inductive logic. In working out the conditions for a good argument, we introduced 5 informal fallacies: circular, ambiguous, appeal to emotion, beside the point, and straw man. We now add 13 more in 3 groups. While this course covers most common fallacies, there are many others that won't be listed here. Our first group includes 6 fallacies expressed in a premise-conclusion format. This first appeals to our herd instincts. Appeal to crowd. Most people believe A, therefore A is true. So we could say, most people think Wheaties is very nutritious. Therefore, Wheaties is very nutritious. Despite what people think, Wheaties cereal might have little nutritional value. Discovering its nutritional value requires checking its nutrient content. Group opinion proves nothing. While we all recognize the fallacy here, group opinion still may influence us. Humans are only partially rational. The opposition fallacy comes from dividing people into our group, which has the truth, and our opponents, who are totally wrong. Opposition. Our opponents believe A, therefore A is false. For example, we could say, those blasted liberals say we shouldn't raise taxes. Therefore, we shouldn't raise taxes. The problem here is that our opponents may be right. The genetic fallacy dismisses a belief on the basis of its origin. So that would be, we can explain why you believe A, therefore A is false. So for example, any psychologist would see that you believe A because of such and such. Therefore, A is false. One who has superficially studied a little psychology may dismiss another's views in this way. An appropriate but nasty reply is, and what is the psychological explanation for why you confuse psychological explanations with logical disproofs? To show a belief to be false, we must argue against the content of the belief. It's not enough to explain how the belief came to be. The next one has two closely related forms. So we have appeal to ignorance, which could be, no one has proved A, therefore A is false. So for example, no one has proved there's a God, therefore there's no God. Or no one has disproved A, therefore A is true, which could be, no one has proved there's a God, therefore there's a God. Something not proved might still be true, just as something not disproved might still be false. An appeal to ignorance must have one of these forms. It's not just any case where someone speaks out of ignorance. This next one uses a Latin name for after this, therefore, because of this. So post hoc ergo propter hoc is A happened after B, therefore A was caused by B. So for example, Paul had a beer and then got 104% on his logic test. He got 104% because he had beer. The premise was true, there were bonus points. Some students concluded, so if I have a beer before the test, I'll get 104%. And if I have a six-pack, I'll get 624%. Proving causal connections requires more than just the sequence of two factors. The factors might just happen to have occurred together. It's not enough that factors always occur together. Day always follows night, and night always follows day, but neither causes the other. Proving causal connections is difficult. This next one is also called division composition. So part whole. This is F, therefore every part of this is F. So for example, my essay is good, therefore every sentence of my essay is good. Or every part of this is F, therefore this is F. For example, every sentence of my essay is good, therefore my essay is good. The first argument is wrong because an essay might be good despite having some poor sentences. The second is wrong because each sentence of the essay might be good without the essay as a whole being good. To find individual sentences might not make sense together. So something might be true of a whole without being true of the parts, or true of the parts without being true of the whole. A property that characterizes a whole but not any parts is sometimes called an emergent property. Being alive is an emergent property possessed by a cell, but not by any component molecules, and water may be clear and wet without individual H2O molecules being clear or wet. More controversially, some may say thinking is an emergent property possessed by the brain but not by its cells. In rare cases, these fallacy forms might be abbreviated forms of good reasoning. So suppose you know that people in your society almost never have false beliefs. Then this appeal to crowd should be correct inductive reasoning. Almost always, what people in my society believe is true. Most people in my society believe A. That's all we know about the matter. Therefore, probably A is true. Or suppose you know that your opponent Jones is always wrong. Then this could be sound reasoning. Everything Jones says is false. Jones says A, so A is false. But correct forms of these 6 fallacy forms are unusual in real life. Our next group has 3 types of reasoning with correct and fallacious forms. This first type of reasoning appeals to expert opinion. So, appeal to authority. The correct form is X holds that A is true. X is an authority on the subject. The consensus of authorities agrees with X. Therefore, there is a presumption that A is true. So, for example, your doctor tells you A. She's an authority on the subject. The other authorities agree with her. Therefore, there's a presumption that A is true. Incorrect forms omit premise 2 or 3 or conclude that A must be true. This conclusion means that we ought to believe A unless we have special evidence to the contrary. If the doctor is a great authority and the consensus of authorities is large, then the argument becomes stronger, but it's never totally conclusive. All the authorities in the world might agree on something that they later discover to be wrong, so we shouldn't think that something must be so because authorities say it is. It's also wrong to appeal to a person who isn't an authority in the field. A sports hero endorsing coffee makers, for example. And finally, it's weak to appeal to one authority, regarding the safety of nuclear energy, for example, when the authorities disagree widely. The appeal to authority can go wrong in many ways. Yet many of our trusted beliefs, that Washington was the first US president, for example, or that there is such a country as Japan, rest quite properly on the say-so of others. An authority might be a calculator or a computer instead of a human. My calculator has proved itself reliable, and it gives the same result as other reliable calculators. So I believe it when it tells me that 679 times 177 equals 120,183. This next one uses a Latin name for against a person, which is opposed to ad rem on the issue. So ad hominem. The correct form is X holds that A is true. In holding this, X violates legitimate rational standards. For example, X is inconsistent, biased, or not correctly formed. Therefore, X isn't fully reasonable in holding A. So we could say, Rick holds that people of this race ought to be treated poorly. In holding this, Rick is inconsistent because he doesn't think that he ought to be treated that way if he were in their exact place, and so violates legitimate rational standards. Therefore, Rick isn't fully reasonable in his views. Incorrect forms use factors irrelevant to rational competence. For example, X is a member of a hated group or beats his wife, or conclude that A is false. A personal attack argument can be either legitimate or fallacious. In our example, we legitimately conclude that Rick, because he violates rational standards, isn't fully reasonable in his beliefs. It would be fallacious to draw the stronger conclusion that his beliefs must be wrong. To show his beliefs to be wrong, we must argue against the beliefs, not against the person. A more extreme ad hominem was exemplified by Nazis who argued that Einstein's theories must be wrong since he was Jewish. Being Jewish was irrelevant to Einstein's competence as a scientist. This next form of reasoning lists and weighs reasons for and against. So pro-con, the correct form is the reasons in favor of Act A are, the reasons against Act A are, the former reasons outweigh the latter, therefore Act A ought to be done. So we could say, the reasons in favor of getting an internal frame backpack are, the reasons against getting an internal frame backpack are, the former reasons outweigh the latter, therefore I ought to get an internal frame backpack. The incorrect form would be, the reasons in favor of Act A are, therefore Act A ought to be done. People sometimes make decisions by folding a piece of paper in half and listing reasons in favor on one side and reasons against on the other. Then they decide intuitively which side has stronger, not necessarily more, reasons. This method forces us to look at both sides of an issue. In the incorrect form, we just look at half the picture. We say that you should do this because of such and such advantages, or that you shouldn't do it because of such and such disadvantages. This fallacy is also called one-sided or stacking the deck. We can expand our three correct forms into standard inductive and deductive arguments. A correct appeal to authority becomes a strong inductive argument if we add this inductively confirmed premise. The consensus of authorities on a subject is usually right. Correct ad hominem arguments become deductively valid if we add anyone who, in believing A, violates legitimate rational standards and is thereby not fully reasonable in believing A. And correct pro-con arguments become deductively valid if we add, if the reasons in favor of A outweigh the reasons against A, then A ought to be done. Our final group has four miscellaneous fallacies. Here's the first fallacy, which is also called false dilemma. Black and white thinking oversimplifies by assuming that one or another of two extreme cases must be true. One commits this fallacy in thinking that people must be logical or emotional, but can't be both. My thesaurus lists these terms as having opposite meanings. But if they really had opposite meanings, then no one could be both at once, which is indeed possible. In fact, all four combinations are common: logical and emotional, logical and unemotional, illogical and emotional, and illogical and unemotional. People who think in a black and white manner prefer simple dichotomies, like logical emotional, capitalist socialist, or intellectual jock. Such people have a hard time seeing that the world is more complicated than that. This next fallacy is also called hasty generalization. To use the false stereotype is to assume that the members of a certain group are more alike than they actually are. People commit this fallacy in thinking that all Italians exist only on spaghetti, that all New Yorkers are uncaring, or that all who read Karl Marx want to overthrow the government. False stereotypes can be detrimental to the stereotyped. A study compared scores on a math test of two otherwise identical groups of young girls. Just the first group was told beforehand that girls are genetically inferior in math, and this group did much worse on the test. This next fallacy substitutes violence for reasoning. The appeal to force is to use threats or intimidation to get a conclusion accepted. A parent might say, just agree and shut up. Parents and teachers hold inherently intimidating positions and are often tempted to appeal to force. This last fallacy is also called trick question. A complex question is a question that assumes the truth of something false or doubtful. The standard example is, are you still beating your wife? A yes implies that you still beat your wife, while a no implies that you used to beat her. The question combines a statement with a question. You have a wife and used to beat her. Do you still beat her? The proper response is your question presumes something that's false, namely that I have a wife and used to beat her. Sometimes it's misleading to give a yes or no answer. Inconsistency. Inconsistency is the most important fallacy, the most important deceptive error of thinking. Students writing on philosophical issues for the first time often express inconsistent views, as in this example. Since morality is relative to culture, no duties bind universally. What's right in one culture is wrong in another. Universal duties are a myth. Relativism should make us tolerant toward others. We can't say that we're right and they're wrong. So everyone ought to respect the values of others. Here the first statement is incompatible with the last. No duties bind universally, and everyone ought to respect the values of others. If everyone ought to respect the values of others, then some duties bind universally. And if no duties bind universally, then neither does the duty to respect the values of others. This inconsistency isn't trivial, it cuts deeply. The unexamined views that we use to guide our lives are often radically incoherent. Putting these views into words often brings out their incoherence. The ancient Greek philosopher Socrates was adept at showing people how difficult it was to have consistent beliefs on the deeper questions of life. Inconsistency is common in other areas too. Someone running for political office might talk to environmentalists one day and industrialists the next. Each group must be told exactly what it wants to hear. The first group is told, I'll support stronger clean air standards. The second is told, I'll try to lower clean air standards. We can't be sure that the politician, if elected, will violate some of the promises. One can't fulfill incompatible promises. We often aren't aware of our inconsistency. For example, one might believe all three of these. 1. God is good. 2. Predestination is true. God immediately causes everything that happens. 3. God damns sinners to eternal punishment. These three beliefs aren't inconsistent in themselves. But the person might have other beliefs that add to these three to make an inconsistent set. 4. If a predestination is true, then God causes us to sin. 5. If God causes us to sin and yet damns sinners to eternal punishment, then God isn't good. This set of 5 beliefs is inconsistent. Beliefs 2 and 4 entail God causes us to sin. This, with 3 and 5, entails God isn't good, which contradicts 1. So the 5 beliefs can't all be true together. Someone who believes all 5 might not be aware of the inconsistency. The beliefs might not have come together in the person's consciousness at the same time. Inconsistency is a sign that our belief system is flawed and we need to change something. Logic can tell us that our belief system is inconsistent, but it can't tell us how to rearrange beliefs to regain consistency. That's up to us. Controversies often arise when a set of individually plausible statements can't consistently be combined. Consider this group of statements. F equals some human actions are free. D equals all human actions are determined. I equals no determined actions are free. Even though each claim by itself is plausible, this set is inconsistent. If we take any two of these statements as premises, we can infer the denial of the third. Hard determinists take D, determinism, and I, that determinism is incompatible with free will, as premises. They include not F, that we have no free will. So they would say, all human actions are determined, no determined actions are free, therefore no human actions are free. or D, I, therefore not F. Indeterminists take F, free will, and I, that determinism is incompatible with free will, as premises. They conclude not D, the falsity of determinism. They would say some human actions are free, no determined actions are free, therefore some human actions aren't determined. So that would be F, I, therefore not D. Soft determinists take F, free will, and D, determinism, as premises. They conclude not I, that determinism isn't incompatible with free will. So they would say some human actions are free, all human actions are determined. Therefore, some determined actions are free. So that would be F, D, therefore not I. Each of the three arguments has plausible premises. All three arguments are valid, but at most one of them can have true premises. The three arguments relate to each other in an interesting way. Each argument is a turnaround of the other two. An argument is a turnaround of another argument if each results from the other by switching the denial of a premise with the denial of the conclusion. Here is an example. So we see hard determinism versus indeterminism. They switch the position of the D's and the F's. As you'll see from the exercise, several classical philosophical disputes involve turnaround arguments. In each dispute, we have a set of individually plausible statements that can't be consistently combined. A single statement may be inconsistent with itself. A self-refuting statement is a statement that makes such a sweeping claim that it ends up denying itself. Suppose I tell you, everything that I tell you is false. Could this be true? Not if I tell it to you, then it has to be false. The statement refutes itself. Or suppose I say, I know that there's no human knowledge. This couldn't be true. If it were true, then there would be some human knowledge, thus refuting the claim. A self-refuting claim often starts as a seemingly big, bold insight. The bubble bursts when we see that it destroys itself. Consistency relates ethical beliefs to actions in a special way. Suppose I believe that this man is bleeding. That belief doesn't commit me, under pain of inconsistency, to any specific act. How I live can be inconsistent with this belief taken by itself. But suppose I believe that I ought to call the doctor. This ethical belief does commit me, under pain of inconsistency, to action. If I don't act to call the doctor, the way I live is inconsistent with my belief. Consistency requires a harmony between our ethical beliefs and how we live. Many consistency arguments in ethics depend on the universalizability principle, on which nearly all philosophers agree. Universalizability claims that whatever is right, wrong, good, bad, etc., in one case, also would be right, wrong, good, bad, etc., in any exactly or relevantly similar case, regardless of the individuals involved. Here's an example adapted from the Good Samaritan parable. Suppose that while I'm jogging, I see a man who's been beaten, robbed, and left to die. Should I help him, perhaps by making a phone call? I think of excuses why I shouldn't. I'm busy, don't want to get involved, and so on. I say to myself, it would be all right for me not to help him. But then I consider an exactly reversed situation. I imagine myself in this place. I'm the one who's been beaten, robbed, and left to die. And I imagine him being in my place, he's jogging, seeing me in my sad state, and has the same excuses. I ask myself, would it be all right for this man not to help me in this situation? Surely not. But then I'm inconsistent. What's all right for me to do in another has to be all right for the other to do to me in an imagined exactly reversed situation. So that's the end of the lesson. So the homework is going to be a 35 question worksheet that I'll post on Google Classroom.